Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me again for our webinar this week. And this week is a fascinating subject. With me again is Ben Hanley, who we're always happy to see, of course, one of our most respected contemporary specialists. And this week brings us to Warhol, probably one of the most known mid-20th century artists there is, and usually in pretty much everyone's rundown of iconic art every year. And obviously when those pieces do come up, some of them make an absolute fortune. So Ben, we'll start as we normally start when we talk about this type of thing. Tell me a little bit about Warhol, how you got into Warhol and what part he plays in your working life.
How did I get into Warhol? I mean, I got my background is I've been in the art market for 25 years. I'm a specialist and an advisor in post-war contemporary. So when you talk about post-war contemporary, I mean, there are certain monoliths that come up, whether you like the work or not. And I love Warhol's work, but you can't get away from Warhol. I mean, he defines for 20 years one of the most important periods of American art. I mean, he is, I think, if even for the most uneducated or inexperienced art collector or somebody looking at art, Warhol is just he encapsulates contemporary art for most people.
It's a powerhouse of a name, really, to be perfectly honest. And everyone knows it.
Yeah, and the word iconic, I mean, it's so overused these days, but I mean, Warhol really is iconic. I mean, partly because of the imagery he used was iconic in many ways, but I mean, his position in contemporary art, I mean, it's huge.
Let's look at Warhol from the point of view as being this iconic figure and massively influential throughout this period of the mid-20th century. The pop culture thing was exploding. What do you think he took from that?
Well, it's not that he took from it. He's a product of his time. America post-war, it was dominant culturally and economically. I mean, America. I don't think we can overestimate how the shift in market forces, cultural forces that came out post-war. America was cool. America was rich, and for a world that was starved of imagery, to have. Nowadays we have images thrown everywhere. There's almost overload in imagery. In the 50s and early 60s, imagery was just coming out, photography, cinema, such like. So the power of the image was much more intense than it is now. So prior to the generation prior to Warhol, there were the abstract expressionist artists, Rothko, de Kooning, Pollock, whose work was hugely international, hugely influential internationally, but wasn't, how do we say, particularly engaging to the average guy on the street. Warhol came out of that genre. His generation were rebelling against the concepts of abstract expressionist art. They linked into the advertising, what was going on, the cinema, the excitement that was they felt on the street. They also wanted to break away from the narrow confines of what art was. Art with the abstract expressionist movement had to be on a canvas, it had to be painting, had to be serious, had to be shown in a gallery. What they felt, what the new generation of artists felt was art, was a much broader version of that. And you've got to, with Warhol in particular, you've got to understand that he started out not as a fine artist, but as a commercial artist. So his definition of art, just from the get-go, was much more for advertising, for marketing. I mean, it wasn't a gallery scenario. So he was able to, he saw no restrictions from pulling influences from, from Campbell Soup Can, from lots of different genres and iconography and outside of the normal confines of the art market. That was extremely vigorous and energizing to the art market.
So I think, to my mind of it, really, what he was looking at doing is almost trying to stop anyone from defining it was that what he could do. It was almost a case of being almost allowed to say, well, no, I don't just want to explore this. I don't just want to explore that. It's pretty much everything that I want to be able to look at, whether it's flat, whether it's taking influences from other things and basically incorporating them all over.
Yeah, I don't think it was that it was a conscious thing. I think it was just, remember, he was young, and the youth has a different perception of things, and the influences are the influences of their childhood. He just didn't see, and his generation, Lichtenstein, etc., Rauschenberg, all the greats, they just weren't confined by the more traditional paradigm of Western art. So for them, it wasn't, I don't even sure it was a conscious thing, but they were very happy to appropriate imagery that would otherwise never have be considered a source material for art. But for them, it was an image is an image is an image. Also, the influence of the technology of their day, photography, of cinema. You know, America at the time, Hollywood was at its biggest. I mean, you had the massive stars. The Hollywood system was at its most influential. So all the icons of modern American culture were photographic, not painting. That comes in very much, and advertising was just starting as a medium. So all those things just collided into influencing his entire generation. And I think it was as much subconscious as conscious.
Do you think, and you touched on it a second ago in terms of the middle of the century in America, you know, the profits that were going through the country at this point, the feeling that everyone had coming out of the back end of the Second World War, and people wanting to explore things in terms of their art collections, or people wanting to look at in a slightly more colourful way. I mean, you had it with Chelsea Rains and the Pacific Palisades and things like that, and the way they did interior design. They're looking at using more colour and more design. Do you think Warhol was almost a part of that kind of great growth of joy, I think, more than anything else, going around the country at that point? Or do you think he was actually just happened to be there at that time?
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's more latter, actually. I don't think, as an artist, I always think him as and in a way his personality is his art, and his art is his personality, as all great artists are. I think he was an observer of his time. I don't think his work is ever hugely emotionally embodied or imbued by the artist himself. The mediums that he chose, photography and screen printing, by their nature, they were cooler. I'm not explaining correctly. I mean, the nature of photography enables the artist to capture a moment in time. That's what he does. That's what Warhol does at his absolute best, and he was reflective of the time. So in the early 60s, a lot of his work reflects the political struggles that happened, the race riots, the anti-segregation, that sort of thing, on one side. So they're very aggressive and hard images. And
I think we'll have one on here, Ben, which obviously I think is a very, very well-known piece.
He did a whole series of electric chairs, which is, I mean, when you look at them in a way, you forget exactly what you're looking at, because they're very beautiful images, the colors, etc., etc. But it's a statement, never for or against the death penalty and the American judicial system. I mean, he never makes judgment calls. That's why I don't think he's an emotive artist, but he turns his sort of lamp of his art on specific subjects. And at the time, this was very emotive, and the misuse of it in the Deep South and things like that, and therefore the race riots and so on and so forth. So it's fine. Well,
it is still a haunting image, though. I don't think you could ever have a picture of that. And it's.
He had a commercial artist. Look, when I say he's a commercial artist, I'm underplaying him massively. But he came from a commercial background, so he can recognize fantastic imagery, and then he takes them and uses them himself. So I mean, he gives them a new context and a new life to them and importance. But I mean, it's a very haunting image, but it's the image which he didn't create that's haunting. So he is a
I see what you mean.
He has a talent. It's almost political reportage, but it doesn't have to be political. For example, at this time he also did some of his major imagery of Liz Taylor, of Marilyn Monroe, of Elvis Presley. They're iconic because once again, I think it's difficult to understand the power and importance of the cinema in those times, how they literally represented American culture to the world. So they became the icons as much as civil liberty and etc. within America.
It is funny, really, that massive gulf that almost lies between 100%. Those works, where you've got almost a flagrant consumerism kind of mindset. Although with Warhol, you never know if there was a kind of a twist on it or not. I think we could probably discuss that all day, whether as we had a conversation once in the past, perhaps he just wanted to draw a picture of Mickey Mouse as opposed to it having some deep and meaningful kind of scenario. But it's a funny one with the different kind of styles of things that he obviously kind of went through. Did anyone really ever kind of go into his politics or what he stood or what he thought for in that time? Because obviously, along with the race riots politically, obviously it was a very, very changing kind of time. You know, especially in the 60s when he was putting stuff out.
You hinted at him earlier in a comment you made about does anyone ever know Warhol? He deliberately created a persona where nobody really, he was androgynous. He was in both sexually. I mean, clearly he was gay, but he was sexually androgynous in the way he looked and the way he acted, but also politically, sexually. You never knew his feelings or his thoughts on things. So one thing that lies at the core of Warhol's work is he was an American, and he was fascinated by America and the duality in America. You had the glitz and the glamour on one side, you had the underbelly underneath it all. So you get both sides, and they're both reported in equal importance. They're both becomes icons. They're both, whether it's a car crash, whether it is Jackie Kennedy post the assassination of her husband, that very famous haunting image, or Mickey Mouse. For him, they're of equal importance in terms of their should they or should they not be used in art. Normally, the political and the historic in art history has always been more important and has been seen as at a higher level. For him, they are dualities of the American dream and the American reality. And as I said, I keep saying it, but I think nowadays where the world is homogenous, I mean, we all know what's going on. In America, American culture at that time was flash, brash, new, at the antithesis of everything in the West. So it stuck out like a sore thumb and was super sexy. And America was the golden country. People, the world in the West was falling apart. So people, the pavements in New York are paved in gold. That sort of, and the American dream. He embodied that and was fascinated by America. He himself was a Polish immigrant, or from immigrant stock. So he was part of the American dream, but he was happy to, his work is all about America. And as I said, what was happening at the time. But most artists would tend to pick one area where they were more interested and focus on that subject. With Warhol, there was the duality that appealed to him.
I mean, he's always been, in my mind, and especially in terms of artists and their personalities, it's always been, there hasn't been an artist and a piece of work. He almost appears to me as not being a piece of the work, but there is that certain entity about his character, which basically extends from his work in order to make it, even more, not surreal at all, but just kind of individual. I think that's probably the better description for it, and the way he kind of went about it. Now, in this period, let's go back to the mid-20th century now, and other people that were working alongside Warhol and other people that were doing a lot more things surrounding him. Were there any contemporaries that he mixed with, and were there any contemporaries that we know of as almost as well as him nowadays?
I mean, the art market is a much more modern concept, but the art scene in New York or in America was based around mainly around New York. It was a tiny market, and there wasn't. I mean, our concept of the art market being a financial market, to a very great degree, there wasn't huge amounts of money in the art market. So, and it was a very small market. So clearly, and a very small scene. And these were artists starting out. So he mixed with all his contemporaries, with Rauschenberg, with Roy Lichtenstein, with all the great Robert Indiana. I mean, they all knew each other. In terms of, he created his own scene, though, in fairness, and people, to a degree, both artistically and socially, culturally, they came to him. He knew the benefit of his own persona, of his own myth. He also, the whole factory scenario which was his studio, which it was more than a studio. He defined a moment in time, that and in the 70s, of the development of the disco scene in New York, in Club 52.
Because he always managed to actually fit. I mean, you say about music, obviously, Velvet Underground, Nico, and all of that, and then up into the 70s the studio and kind of, obviously he always had a finger on the pulse, didn't he? He always seemed to be in the right circles in those kind of things.
100%, but that in a way comes out of it. Very major sort of branch of his interest is in the icons of the day. The true icons were the 1960s, the Marilyns and the Elvises and such like. Yeah. But as time developed, a lot of his work became less political and more cultural and pop culture, and in terms of the icons. So therefore, he was always interested in what was happening, what was cool and hip. I mean, again, one can't overestimate his background as a commercial artist. I mean, and in marketing, there's always if you're a successful commercial artist, you have an interest in what's new, what's hip, what's happening. That is very much one of his main strengths. People have often said it's one of his weaknesses as well, that he was that he potentially can be seen as a one-dimensional and superficial. I don't believe that myself. I think there are some superficial works, but he was very much a voyeur and a spectator, even within his own world. But his art reflected that. I don't think he put any emotion into it, but he curated, to use a lovely word nowadays, he curated his vision of what was going on at the time, and then he presented it, almost in a cold way, in my view.
Yeah, Ben, why do you think, though, that his work now is obviously, when we look at, and when I do talks and when you do talks, obviously, about certain artists, there are ones that we look at and we go, okay, well, they've gone up and some of them have gone down. And there seems to be, obviously, with a lot of art, and that's the nature of the art market, things go up and things go down. There has always been what I would describe as not a constant, but there has always been a lot of support, shall we say, for his works. And regardless of when they were manufactured, still having that name on still conjures up that fantastic magic that only Warhol can bring. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's had from the 70s. I mean, clearly prices have gone up, etc., etc. But there's always been a passion for his work. I mean, he defined a moment, and everybody wants. And there was a magic moment in New York in the 70s, and it was all glitzy and fabulous and such like. So he was inextricably linked to that. So, but just by association, there will always be a little bit of gold dust attached by association to Warhol. His imagery is extremely iconic. So if collectors have always been drawn to artists that are easily recognizable. I'm not wanting to dumb it down, but if you walk into a house and there's a Warhol there, you'll know it's a Warhol. So that's an easy tick. But the iconography is extremely livable, extremely accessible. So all those things, they build a very wide collector base. But also, you can. I went into this in the article. His collector base is at many different levels financially. For an artist of his fame and importance, he produced huge amounts of limited edition prints. So there are different markets that feed the entry levels and the collecting budgets of different collectors. That's huge.
Do you think that having those lower feeders will actually then at 20 years time, when they've got into this and think, you know what, now it's going to be time that I'm going to spend a decent amount on a piece because I've had all these through my collecting life?
Well, I mean, that just is very much depends on the trajectory of the collectors, individual collectors' budgets. But yes, clearly, if you like Warhol and you suddenly make more money, you can upgrade. But the importance of the more entry-level pieces, we'll call them, is it just feeds a commercial market needs to have. It's a balance between supply and demand. Too much supply and not enough demand, and the prices go down. But you need to have supply to whip up interest and to feed interest. And the lower end, should we say, the print market. And remember, the iconography and the images are exactly the same as they are on the canvas. So for $30,000, $50,000, $100,000. I mean, we're not talking no money, but it's relatively small money. Yeah. You can still have a Warhol, and that's what the importance of the breadth of his media that he worked in. That's the importance to the market, rather than pushing people up into more expensive. It just feeds.
Because I think as a marketable asset, and obviously what he was obviously a good businessman as well, because he was looking at selling.
He knew his brand.
Yeah. he was looking at exactly his brand. He was looking at selling his pieces and looking at selling his works. And if he limited himself to one 12-foot by 12-foot canvas every year, then it was obviously going to limit his income potential. So from his point of view, producing screen prints of a certain amount of this and a certain amount of that, and potentially sometimes in different colors, it obviously meant that people were looking to buy them. And those were the ones now that are trading hands for decent go tens of thousands of pounds.
But also, I mean, I think you're missing one point with him in that this, in 1963, he started to use screen printing. There's a conceptual thing behind Warhol about the manufacturing process. I mean, the preciousness of producing a work of art, he didn't rate or didn't buy into. The whole reason his studio was called the factory was the factory system, and therefore he was drawn to the factory process as a conceptual thing. Now, clearly, because of that, his production is huge. So but I don't think he originally used screen printing, and therefore saw the huge potential for large numbers of work. I don't think that was a deliberate thing at the beginning. It was a conceptual thing.
Do you think he wanted
a large amount of work on the market?
Do you think he wanted people to have his work then? Do you think that was more important to him than actually making lots and lots of money? So in fact,
no,
as you quite rightly said, the factory kind of side of things.
He always had an eye to money. I mean, he was very, very astute. And to be honest with you, the later work in the 80s, I mean, he arguably sold out with a lot of these society portraits where he would paint portraits of totally unknowns for $100,000. So he was very definitely motivated by money. But the concept of a mechanical production line was at the core of his values as well as an artist. So it wasn't a sellout at all. It was the core.
But there was art for the masses almost, though. These people, were deserving of something that was important, if you see what I mean. It's almost like Corbusier with buildings, designing something beautiful for people to actually own.
I don't think he was that egalitarian, to be honest with you. I think he would want everybody to know who he was and what his art is, in terms that everybody should own a work of his. No, I don't think that ever factored in his mind. I don't think there was no socialist principles behind his art at all, shall we say. He was very, very definitely known for being quite commercial, but he wanted his art to be seen, and therefore he was very keen on his building his persona. I mean, he used his persona, particularly in the 70s, to as a promotional tool as much as anything else. And his fame grew. I mean, he was linked into with all, as you touched on, all the coolest clubs, musicians, etc., etc. So he used, it was a symbiotic relationship. His art, his fame, his personality, the people he mixed with. As I said, that's the stardust and the golden dust that still hangs around Warhol to a great degree.
Still there. Ben, I'm going to just ask you one more question before I start taking some potential questions from the floor. In terms of items that you've actually dealt with or you've handled, and it's a question I always ask you on this kind of tricky point, is if you could have one piece now, what would you have?
What do you mean, a Warhol?
Yeah.
You've shown it, although I think I might choose a different colorway. I'd love one of his electric chairs. I think they're absolutely beautiful. I don't think my wife would let it in the house. It's too tough. But for me, it's the fact that he makes such a very edgy and disturbing image. For me, very, very beautiful. He also did a series of memento mori skulls, which was shown photographed in very chiaroscuro lighting, very, very strong lighting. So you have shadows, and that whole series I think is spectacular. They're like still lives, but they go into the European tradition of life, death, etc. And with either of those two, I take a lot of his work in fairness, but those two I love.
So when we're looking at the three Elvises, what do you think on the current market? What would you have to pay to get that one of those in your home?
Triple Elvis, you're going at this stage. You're talking $100 million.
Gosh.
Yeah, it's not cheap. It has to be said. I think that particular one sold in 2014, and I'm going to say for 60, 70 million. I could be wrong, but it wasn't 100. I think the highest figure so far has been was 105 for his green car crash canvas. But to be honest with you, no major work by Warhol has come up since 2015. There's been lots of good works, but there haven't been any
major
iconic. So it'd be interesting to see. But I mean, that work would make over 100 million now. Absolutely.
Do you think in this current climate it's going to suffer at all, or do we think it's, you know,
it depends what market, which market are you talking about? I mean,
well, if we're talking about the
that
Elvises,
market, no, not at all. I mean,
it's just going to,
yeah, those 60s iconic, massively important pieces, they'll always make the money. Who knows where the market? I mean, his mid market. Who knows in the future? It's not so much Warhol market as everybody's market. We'll have to suck it and see for a while and see where the chips fall in terms of the economy. But the top end of his market will always be strong.
The top end. Ben, I've had a couple of questions in from the floor before we finish today. Somebody's written in and says they've got a client with a Warhol screen print. We're obviously at a slightly different level than we're talking about with the Elvises here. But has that gone up in the last 2 or 3 years? Should they be looking at getting it revalued at this point?
Well, you should always get things revalued. But in terms of screen print, his canvases and his prints are screen prints. One would have to ask the question what actually the specifics are. But I imagine you're talking prints. Absolutely. I mean, his market in since the 90s. His print market has gone through the roof, but again because it tied into, there's been a lot of money in the financial market. It's entry level, but it's iconic, so it's grown hugely. For example, you can get a Muhammad Ali set of 3, a full portfolio. It's, gosh, I think you could have bought them for about 25,000 25 years ago. Now 250,000 nearly pounds. So I mean they've gone exponentially. Now clearly it's not just the value is linked to the image. So some images are more popular and therefore more iconic and therefore more expensive. So come out. We'll do a valuation for you.
And I couldn't think of anyone nicer. Ben, with exhibitions, obviously the last one that there was in New York, does this increase the value? Does this raise awareness, or does it just mean that more people are in? Does it mean that just more people want to be going and buying cheap posters?
No, because the people who are going to buy cheap posters will always buy cheap posters. It's as simple as that. You know, buying art is, everybody wants it to be non-elitist. It is elitist purely because it takes cash to do so. So what it does, these blockbuster shows, what the importance of them is, it solidifies his position in the collective mind of everybody about his importance. It also it introduces his art to a new generation. So therefore, it just facilitates his reputation. I don't think a blockbuster will increase his market per se, but it will give longevity.
Excellent. Ben, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there today because we are running a little bit low on time. But as always, it's been absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure something we could probably talk about for a much longer period of time. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much again for joining Ben and I today, having a chat about the fantastic Warhol. If you'd like to join us again, we'll be doing a couple of more of these before the end of the season, not with Ben, thankfully for Ben, and we will all be speaking to you very soon. Remember to follow us in LinkedIn, and you'll be able to get all of our updates and all of the articles that people such as Ben, myself, and everyone else in the team actually put out. So a pleasure, as always, Ben. Thank you again.
You're very welcome, sir.
And ladies and gentlemen, we will see you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye now.